for you to get forth with any questions that you have. I know there is a lot of confusion surrounding ROS 2, and a lot of people are somewhat worried about the requirements of the technical file. So hopefully we'll get to answer a lot of those for you today and show you some practical applications of due diligence, what to look for in a technical file, what to look for in declarations of conformity, and from that we can get your questions and maybe get some more specific detailed answers out to you. So for those of you that don't know about Assent, I'll give you a little bit of background on our company. We have three kind of main arms, if you will, as far as services go. So on the one hand, we have consulting. So our consulting groups helps different businesses, our clients, helps them identify and interpret different global environmental regulations, interpret the impact, go over the risks, help design compliance strategies that will allow them to build robust programs to get the necessary compliance information that they need to comply with those requirements. And the IT group helps design our IT applications. We'll actually be seeing that later when we look on how to generate a ROS 2 technical file. So the IT group designs the platforms by which our clients generate and receive and process and communicate compliance and material information. And our operations team are the those the people that help with program implementation. So helping people actually go through, collect these declarations, store them, data entry, project management, things like that. So here's a top level agenda for today. So we're going to be starting out with, as I mentioned, going over the recast, looking at what are the requirements for declarations of conformity, what are the requirements for the technical file. Then we're really going to move in and have a big focus on due diligence, testing, test reports, what to look for. I've got a sample technical file that I'm going to show you and go over with you, so that you can get an actual idea visually of what you're looking at in the technical file. Going to go over some of the different aspects of enforcement, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And just to note, all of the slides, the material, recording, all of this is going to be made available after the presentation. Okay, so ROS 2. So ROS 2 was published last summer. Came into effect July 21st, 2011, and it's going into force at a member state level on January 2nd, 2013. So you can see a little timeline. We have today's date, May 23rd. Let's look at the new products that are going to come into scope. So we can see that medical devices and consumer monitoring control instruments are going to be coming into force in summer 2014. Then a few years later, we have in vitro diagnostic devices, and then the year after that, professional monitoring and control, and then all the way out in 2019 in July, we have the Category 11, the kind of other equipment. Now, what's important to take away from this is I know that a lot of you, or some of you rather, on the webinar today are in the medical industry, and when you see those deadlines, and I know some of those seem a way off, but when you see medical devices 2014, a lot of the top-end players, shall we say, like the GE Healthcare, for example, in the medical industry, they have very long, as you can imagine, lead times when it comes to design. And so when they're thinking about how are they going to design their products, who are they going to source those, the materials and components for those products from, that is why they're really starting to come to you now, even though it's a few years away. And you can say, well, we're not in scope now, and we're not going to be in scope till 2014. They need to know now who are the partners that they are going to work with in the future so that they can source, design, and select their suppliers appropriately. So that's just a little bit of background for you as to why some of you may be receiving a little bit more pressure than usual and having a little bit more questions asked about your RoHS compliance program. Okay, ROS 2 and the CE mark. So most of you, as I hope would know, and now one of the requirements that comes under the CE mark is going to be RoHS, the recast, ROS 2. So, and that's going to start taking effect January 2nd of 2013. So what that means is that for your products that you have the CE mark applied to them, that also means that not only do you have to do your, your EMC or your LDV or whatever have you on the safety side, you are also going to have a section in your technical file, which is Module A. You're going to have a section on RoHS 2 and how you comply, which we're going to speak to in a little bit. That's what this all means when they talk about, oh, it's part of the CE mark now. That's what it means. RoHS 2 is now an equal marking, a requirement that comes under scope of the CE marking directive. So if you put the CE mark on your product, or your customers are putting the CE mark on their product, you're going to have, as part of that technical file, a RoHS 2 section. And so whenever anyone talks about the RoHS 2 technical file, that's what it is. It's the portion of the technical file for a CE mark that speaks to RoHS 2 and your compliance thereof. They're also for the declarations of conformity now, as part of Annex 6, they actually have a standard format that they want when people are passing through declarations of conformity. I'm going to go over those 7 points later. This is applicable to finished products in scope of the RoHS recast. You need to have a technical file for any of those products that are in scope of the recast and placed on the market after January 2nd, 2013. So I have a quick little matrix here, and again, really keeping this high level, trying to hit the main points for you. On the left-hand side, we've got the responsibilities of a manufacturer. On the right-hand side, what are the RoHS 2 responsibilities of an importer? So for a lot of you today are on the left-hand column, and you're getting pressure from people in the right-hand column, which are the importers, your customers. So if you look at the top points that we're hitting here under manufacturer, we've got the EU Declaration of Conformity. We've got the technical file, the CE mark, and the appropriate product markings. On the right-hand side, if you're the importer, your responsibility is to make sure that the manufacturer has taken care of all those steps. So the Declaration of Conformity, what are the actual requirements here? So here's some general requirements for the Declaration of Conformity. And you know what? This is really basic stuff. I would hope that most of you today, your declarations currently match. There's 7 ones. I've got some on the next screen too. I hope that your declarations hit, at least 4 or 5 of these already. So, this is basic stuff like your product number, the name and address of your company, who's the person responsible for this, what are you actually declaring? Are you declaring this to RoHS? What is the name of the regulation? What is the declaration? You'd be surprised how many people they go through all these steps and they have names and addresses and signatures, and then they're not even really clear on what they're declaring. It's like, well, I know this is to RoHS, and I know who's making this declaration, but what are you actually saying here? You want to be very clear and concise in what you're declaring. Also, we're looking, if you have any references to any other applicable standards, specifically harmonized standards, you want to reference those out as well. Signature lines, things like this. One thing that people often miss is that this declaration must be translated into the language of the member state where the product is placed on the market in. So that's a very common one that people miss out on. And yes, I know, and a lot of people speak English, and it seems to be, the universal language, and people are putting out these declarations. But, if you go into Europe, companies are well within their rights to ask you to provide one in, French, Spanish, German, etc. So be prepared for that. There's many services out there that you can, get these declarations translated for, and it's a one-time cost, and then you have it there. Now the technical file, the dreaded technical file. So currently, as a module A of the decision, all of the requirements for information it needs to be in a technical file is all out there. The format, however, has not been standardized. That's really, if you see at the bottom there, I've got EN 50581. That will be the standard for EU technical files. It's currently in the voting stage. I'll speak to that more on the next page. But all of the requirements for that file are already out here. So you know what you have to do. What they're still debating on is, kind of how we put it together, what are the standards. But looking at some of the items here, they really do make sense when you're looking at a description of the product. Maybe designs, any specifications, drawings, schemas, description of that information. So a description of the drawings and the different schemas. As well, any harmonized standards that may be relevant and applicable to the material composition of the product. For example, if your part of it has stainless steel, and you're specifying that stainless steel from your suppliers to a common industry standard that calls it the material composition of that stainless steel, you might want to include that in there. Also, any results of any design calculation made, any examinations, audits that's been taken out, and you know, and a little bit of a description about what your current RoHS program is. And if you've been going back, I know that typically people do what we would call a supplier survey, where you're sending out a request to your supply chain and getting those responses back. Okay, well, you want to itemize that in there. What were the results of that survey? You know, what were the responses back from your suppliers? If you're doing testing, what was the test methodology that was applied? You know, are you doing XRF testing? I mean, how are you going about doing that testing? What were the results? Where are the test reports? What about how do you come to inconclusive results? How do you resolve those? And the statement they actually have in there is that the documentation shall make it possible to assess the product conformity to the relevant requirements and shall include an adequate analysis and assessment of the risk. So, you know, at a top level in layman's terms, you're really just looking at, here's my product, here's how it's designed, here are the relevant standards and relevant standards and specifications that apply to this product. This is what we do for RoHS. Here are the results of what we do, and here's our backup information. You know, and you might want to have a link to you can have a link to a repository, or perhaps you know, you say if it's required offline, you can provide those things, like so the actual test reports, the actual declarations of, from suppliers. You want to make sure that that's retrievable somehow as well. Technical file EN 50581, the standard that's going to come out. That's really what that's going to do is provide the framework for which all of that information that I just mentioned above, you know, what standard is that put into? So how do you demonstrate that? What's the format? Where does it go? Etc. When talking about information that needs to be in a technical file, you know, just give you a couple of little references that you might hear from people when they talk about, you know, Directive 2011-65-EU. They're talking about the recast. You know, when they talk about Module A, I mean, that's when they talk about the technical file. And then also we have IEC 62476, which used to be the guidance for evaluation of these products. So just a couple of key terms there that you might hear thrown about, and you know, it's just really what they mean. I mean, the EN 50581 is going to encompass all of those and provide a standard for which you can put the technical file into form. Now, currently, it's at the voting stage, and the original schedule was that it was supposed to come into effect about a year from now. Now, because everybody does like to have these standards out in the open and interpretations out there, there's a little bit of a push to try and get that timeline cut in half. So let's get this, you know, in effect in 6 months. It's, again, still at the voting stage, still a lot of discussion going around, but that's what the current picture looks like right now. As far as beyond EN 50581, the EU Commission has stated that they're not really going to release any more comments, interpretations, or anything on the RoHS recast. Once 50581 passes, you know, the EU Commission is going to basically consider themselves done with you know, all of the legal text, interpretations, analysis, etc. of the RoHS recast. In fact, they also released a note stating that you know, where it says here, that bottom one, it is in the event of the Court of Justice alone. So they're basically saying, as far as interpretation and specific meaning in the EU laws, if you have any, you know, issues that you want to take up that will no longer be with the EU Commission, you're going to have to take it to the EU Court of Justice. So just, you know, I know a lot of people are saying, well, there's still discussion and people want to change how things are categorized in there. EN 50581 is pretty much the end of the line as far as the EU Commission's involvement with this. So just to recap, you know, if you're looking at, and I know that this can be very intimidating, especially for those of you that may not have a robust RoHS program, and you know, this might seem like a daunting task. Here are, you know, your 4 high-level tasks that you're going to have to do for the technical file. So number 1, determine the information needed. You know, so okay, so do I need declarations? Do I need to set up a procedure? Do I need to get test reports? What am I going to test? Who am I going to collect, you know, declarations from? You know, really setting up that process and determining what you need. That's your first step. Kind of, what are my requirements? What do I need to do? Who do I need to talk to? What do I need to test, etc. The second step is, okay, going and collecting that information. So getting the declarations from your suppliers, you know, for products that are in scope, going and getting your test reports, etc. So collection of that information. The third step, which can involve a lot of heavy lifting, is, you know, evaluating that information. So how good are my declarations? What kind of due diligence programs do my suppliers have? What about these test reports? What do those mean? Do we have to do any redesign? And then finally, ensuring that the technical documentation remains valid. So that's a big thing as well. I know that, hey, we've dealt with customers before that when they come to us, they've said, oh, well, we've gone back to our supply chain and we have declarations of conformity already. And when we have a look at them, they're from 2004, 2005. Some of them say, yes, we will be compliant with RoHS in the future. So it's very important that you keep this documentation valid. And that really is actually spoken to in the regulation. Typically what that means in common industry practice means that every year you're kind of doing an internal audit on it, on this information to make sure it's still valid. Perhaps resurveying your supply chain, asking them for up-to-date regulation declarations, going out and doing a little bit more spot testing. So the heavy lifting really does take place in those first three tasks. Once you have this done, you've got those first three items done, keeping on top of it and making sure it remains valid is just a standard part of the process, and really just making sure that you've accounted for new products and getting some updated declarations. That's somewhat easier and less daunting of a task once you've actually gone to that stage. So talking about that, it's a good segue into due diligence. So let's talk about some of the items here. We're going to get into, what is due diligence, and how is it applicable to me, right? So the first thing is when we said, determining the necessary information. So you really want to assess, first of all, who's in scope, what's out of scope, right? What do I have to collect? What don't I have to collect? And when do I have to collect it by? If I'm coming into scope in 2014. How hard down my neck is GE Healthcare breathing? When do I need to get this done? If we have things like professional monitoring equipment that's not due to 2017, okay, well that's really changing what I need to do and how I want to approach it. And not only that, once you've figured out what's in scope, you want to start thinking of, okay, well what's the risk of all of these? To use an example I was talking about before, if I have, stainless steel from some suppliers and there's a well-known standard that they're making it to, and, we're 99% sure about, 99% of the materials in that product, I mean, that's not really a risky product. So maybe for that one, I'm fine with just a DOC. However, maybe if you're buying server racks from people that are installed into a professional location, and you are several tiers away from the people, there's integrators, there's printed circuit boards, resistors, people making the power cables and the frame and the housing. The further removed you get from those suppliers, and the less sure you become of the material composition, that's probably increasing the risk. So you want to make sure that before you set out on this, you want to know exactly what documentation you're going to ask people for and what's going to be acceptable to you. What is going to be your pass-fail criteria? Maybe the things that you determine are high risk, there's a good chance that they're being led, and that these suppliers aren't very knowledgeable about RoHS. Perhaps they become a higher risk, and what that means is maybe you aren't going to be okay with just a declaration of conformity. Maybe you're going to want to ask them about how they got that information. Maybe you're going to want to see what their due diligence requirements are. And maybe you want to do some spot testing to keep them honest. You get 100 declarations. Maybe you do spot testing on 5% of them, and you outsource that to, say, a third-party laboratory like SGS. You say, here you go, I want you to test these 5, just to keep them honest. And if you see that what they're saying matches the test report, maybe the next year you don't spot test them. You do someone else. So you want to make sure that you're determining what the necessary information is, really creating what your internal SOP, standard operating practice, is for RoHS, and really applying it to those products. It's important to know that technical judgment is allowed. So you are allowed to take the technical judgment to say, listen, we draw the specs up for this. We know, what they're making. It's, it's simple stuff. It's a machine shop, right? They're making ingots or screws or something like that. We're not going to go too deep on them. We're happy with DOCs. So, you are allowed to use technical judgment in that first section. So when you're doing that assessment, you're doing that compliance plan, figuring out these are my requirements, this is what I need, this is who I need it from, this is my pass-fail, this is how I'm going to implement that. Then you move on to the second stage, which is where you're actually going about collecting that information. So whether that's doing a supplier survey, or whether that's looking at existing material declarations, looking at different specifications that you're giving to third-party contract manufacturers, making sure that the specifications you give them are compliant, and maybe having them sign off on different terms and conditions. Looking at testing, getting testing done, analyzing those test results, and all of this working in as corrective actions as well, because whenever you do the collection of information, as I'm sure every one of you has experienced, there is going to be times where there's gaps. You're going to have suppliers that either don't respond or respond inadequately. So you want to make sure that when you're collecting that information, at the beginning stage up here, in the determine the necessary information, you have some kind of corrective action or escalation process embedded into your collection of information, so that when you do have missing or inadequate or insufficient information from your suppliers, there is a way for you to escalate and try and improve the quality of that information. Speaking into evaluating the data, so that third step, so this is mandatory for manufacturers, okay? You do have to show some level of due diligence. It's going to have to be there in your technical file, okay? And you're going to have to at least have a kind of a statement as to what you do for the evaluation of this data, and you're going to have to be able to demonstrate it as well. If someone comes and asks you to demonstrate it, you're going to need some kind of retrievable records to show, well, this is what we do. So again, we spoke to that in the beginning. You really want to establish these procedures for evaluating collected information. So what are those procedures? How are they monitored? Where's the audit trail? When you're evaluating these parts, whether it's evaluating these parts or materials or components actually, meet the requirements of the recast, are they in scope of the recast, is the declaration good, was the test a pass fail, that's the type of things that you're going to be doing when you're evaluating the data. You also, as I mentioned before, want to make sure that the data is of sufficient quality, and at the end, this funnel is all working down to one thing at the end. Was the criteria met or was it not met? Was it a pass or a fail? If it's a pass, you include it in your technical file. If it's a fail, further corrective actions or analysis are needed. Because your technical file, you're going to need, it's going to have to pass. I mean, you wouldn't submit something with an EMC saying, oh yeah, this failed. Here's my CE mark, right? So this is all working towards one common goal. You want a 100% pass rate, and you want to make sure that you get there by knowing what you have to gather, when you have to gather it, what the pass-fail criteria are, and what are the corrective actions that will be taken on information and documentation that is neither sufficient and inadequate for the compliance criteria needed to be passed. So it's all working towards that same thing. When you're ensuring the validity of the data, again, this is very good to have a periodic review of the documents, typically every year. You also want to make sure that any documentation represents changes for new products, new suppliers, new assemblies, new materials. Make sure that that's represented in your file. And it really speaks to when you're developing the process at the beginning. At the beginning, you want to account for not only what am I going to do in the next 3 months, what am I doing in the next 2 years, 3 years? I mean, this is all part of a plan. It's all part of a process. And if you implement it properly, while yes, as I mentioned, there is going to be heavy lifting at the beginning, when you get towards years 2 and 3, and you have that kind of evolution of your program, and your due diligence is down pat, you're going to see that your suppliers are cooperating more, and you're really going to see the burden alleviated as it becomes more of a well-oiled machine. All right, so looking at some standard practices, so typically annual updates, as I mentioned before, those audits can be done internally, externally by companies like ours. If there's any significant product changes, you update the file. So with a completeness in the technical file. So when we have like consumables and out-of-scope parts, and just because what we're trying to get at here is when we say that even though the part may not necessarily need to be RoHS compliant due to exemptions or it's out of scope, still include it in the technical file as an addendum. Just to say, hey, by the way, here are the parts that we haven't, we haven't got a declaration for. This is why, it's out of scope. But, just to acknowledge that yes, it is a part of the product. This is part of what we supply to you, but it's not in scope. Okay, so just so that nobody's wondering, there's no mysteries. They're not wondering where those parts went. Again, you're just trying to be as clear and concise as possible. So when we're looking at due diligence and testing, so when it's due diligence and testing, you often hear about EN 62321. Okay, and so this is the EU standard for RoHS testing. Now, it's not mandatory. However, it does provide the most effective method of risk management. Typically, it is less costly than going through a manual kind of override with the supplier. And again, this depends on the type of product, etc. But if you go up to your suppliers, and let's say you send out a survey to 100 of them, and let's also say that you get responses back in some way, shape, or form for 95 of them. So now you're left with 5 parts, 5 suppliers that have not responded. So yes, you could go through to them and you could set up phone calls and tell them, listen, we need a declaration from you. Probably going to require a couple of phone calls. It's going to require a lot of time, either through your quality department or your purchasing department, a lot of back and forth. So depending on the time constraints you have, it might be worth it to look at and say, is it worth it for me to spend, a week's worth, 40 hours worth of employee time to go and do this? Or do I just go spend, $100 to go get it tested? So, it really is something that you need to keep in mind, that while nobody wants to do homogeneous material testing on every single product they have, it still is an effective method to fill in any gaps that may be there. Also, it's recommended to at least have some scan testing in there with XRF in your technical file. It's cheap, it's affordable, and it can be useful. Well, it is not the be-all and end-all, and there are ways you can get inconclusives, and we all understand that. It still is a very effective weapon, how about tool in your toolbox to kind of fix some items. Also helps to use EN 62321 because that is a standard, and anytime you're calling out a standard, it's been, it lends credibility to a statement. So it's not like you're just going off, on your own with your own kind of testing requirements, or following a standard that's already been agreed and approved upon by an independent body. So have a look. I'm going to have a look here at some different test reports and declarations. Now I know that some of you will not be able to read this because it's small, but when we send this out, you can magnify it and you can look at it. But just let's look at some test reports. So these are good test reports here, and you would probably expect that from SGS. So it's the directive is stated, the standard is stated, it's got dates, it's got signatures. It's a well-known laboratory. Product identification is very clear. This is thumbs up, clear, no mysteries. Okay, and now we go to another one. Now again, this has some good things, but it looks like the standard they've called out is the original RoHS and not the recast. But you'll note that most of the elements are included there, but the different requirements that they have called out in this declaration, misnaming of the regulation, a little bit of miswording there. That's that's not good. That's something where you'd want to go back to them and say, listen, do you understand about the new requirements? Do you know about the ROS recast? Just to clarify, and it's probably a typo or something like that, or someone just forgot to update it. That's the likely cause. But part of your process that you're probably going to want to put into place says, well, all of the declarations need to meet the following criteria, and that criteria is probably going to be has the ROS recast called out, not original ROS numbers. So because again, that's being repealed and won't mean anything as of January 2nd. So those are just this is an example of one that's probably good to go, but you just want to do a little bit of corrective action with the supplier and ask them to update a couple of things. I wouldn't see there being any problems with something like that. So we have another one here. This one's a little more troubling. So again, it uses the words things like ROS recast, not really specifying, not including the specific regulatory wording. So using the word vernacular as opposed to using the actual EC number. Always call it out. Don't call it the ROS recast or ROS 2 or anything like that. Just let's be clear. Call it out in its language, especially since you're going to have to translate this into different languages. You don't want anything getting lost in translation. It's got confusing wording in here. So I mean, it starts off by saying that it is ROS compliant. However, the ROS does not pertain to linear technologies. And at the bottom here, you've got a statement that says, that linear is not under any, obligation to provide things to downstream users, or updates to the declaration. And you see, again, their product very likely is compliant, and they probably will provide you updates as requested. But, having that kind of information in there, that's probably something where, you'd want to go back to them and ask some, follow-up questions, right? So you want to be asking things like, oh, well, can you provide us updates? I know you say you don't, but we're going to need updates. Will you provide them if we ask for them? Can you change the wording on this? Can you actually call out the actual ROS, the EC number there? And, maybe they can go on a little bit more into, well, what do you mean it doesn't pertain? Maybe you want to ask them about their due diligence. Well, Because, I mean, if I thought a regulation didn't pertain to me and I wrote a declaration like that, well, what kind of due diligence am I doing? Maybe because it doesn't pertain to them and they don't want to provide updates, maybe they don't really have anyone looking at this. So maybe you want to dig a little deeper. So, as opposed to the last one we just saw, for this one, that's something where maybe you do have to set up a call and you do need to go in a little bit deeper because heaven forbid you ever got called out on something. If one of your customers was to see this and they, and you didn't do anything about a declaration like that, how much confidence are your customers going to be filled with? Not very much, I can tell you that. So again, here's another one. This one's got some different problems to it. Again, you can see that it's in accordance with original RoHS, not the recast. There's no signature. Well, where's the contact information? So this is missing some minor things. Again, it probably is compliant, right? But you want to go to them and say, listen, I need a contact for this information. I need you to sign it. I need you to date it, especially for REACH. What list are you declaring to? I need you to date it, and I want you to change it to the current RoHS, or the new, as of January 2nd, EC legislation number. Again, these are different things you need to be looking at. Now, all of the ones we've looked at are likely good, okay? It's not like there's anything bad or nefarious going on there. You still want to make sure you take a couple of corrective actions here, because as I've shown you just a couple here, you can imagine you've got a couple hundred suppliers, and, your declarations are all over the place with little mistakes like this. You're really, each time exposing your risk, bit by bit to an unacceptable level. So let's talk about enforcement. So enforcement. So whenever people, talking about enforcement, the fines and whatnot, you really have to think about your first line of defense. What are the first things that you think an enforcement agent is going to look at? Okay, it's going to be your technical file and your declarations of conformity. All right. So if your technical file is all jumbled and it's a mess, or it looks incomplete, or it's not precise, that's going to start raising flags. Also, if your declaration of conformity, if it's missing those 7 points, right, it's not dated correctly or signed or calling the wrong number, that's raising flags. And the more flags you raise, the more chance there is for them to go into a more in-depth analysis of your program. For example, the UK, the enforcement body for the UK for RoHS is the National Weights and Measures. And they actually released a RoHS report, and I actually did a webinar on that last year or the year before, I think. If you go on our website, click on attend a webinar and scroll down, it has all of our previous presentations. Check that out, because they actually have a step-by-step process of how they do an enforcement action. And literally, it's like step 1, send out a request. Step 2, so go over that. And I've really shown you some different tactics and strategies to use to comply to these. And you really want to make sure that your first line of defense is your best line of defense, because that's the one that's going to get asked first. If you can answer things promptly, accurately, and with a clear and coherent manner, it's very slim are the chances that you're going to go to that next stage. It's not going to ask you for more, or try and do any audits on you. Also, to be noted, another key difference between REACH and RoHS is for RoHS, it is a lot easier to detect non-compliance. I mean, you can use XRF scans, which are non-destructive. cadmium strips are only like $40. I mean, there's a lot of you can look at screws and see if they're using a hexavalent or a trivalent finishing. So there are a lot of different tactics one can use if you're an enforcement agent to cost-effectively screen a whole bunch of products to see if there's any weakness there. The actual penalties from this, I mean, there's fines which vary member state to member state, but the big one is, the effect to your brand, because if one of your downstream, users, one of the people that you're selling these products to in the EU, if they uncover a non-compliance, they are obligated to inform the member state enforcement agency. So they can't just go back to you and say, oh, I don't think this is compliant, can you fix that? They have to tell the member state enforcement agent. It's going to have to go up on the website. It's going to, it's going to get stuck at customs, rejected at customs. I mean, these are the bad things that are damaging to your brand. That's the big worry here. And also, it's very damaging to your relationship with your customers. If you're providing customers goods saying that it is RoHS compliant, then it's not RoHS compliant. They're not going to want to go back to you, especially when they've had to have their name dragged through the mud by having to go to an enforcement agency. So these are some of the reasons why you're seeing a really big focus lately on RoHS and the technical file and what are you doing, and that's why you're probably seeing a lot more of that from your customers. It's all due to this increase in enforcement. So before we move on to questions, I'm just going to show you a sample technical files, I promise. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm going to show you that using our system, which is obviously, it's good. We want to show you some of the services we do too. So when you're looking at whatever you use to do your RoHS compliance, it's going to be very important that you're able to take homogeneous material information, part level information, and roll it up into a technical file. For example, let's have a look at I think I've got a test product here that we can have. Okay. Yeah, so you can you can see here you have your product detail screen. So you've got all the different breakdowns, reach, what's the product threshold, concentration, RoHS, and you want something that's going to allow you to be able to look at the the top level product, drilling down into components and parts, and so when you're going to that part level, you can see it's RoHS compliant. I've got a RoHS test report. Okay, I've got reach declarations, etc. And you want to make sure that any information that you have at this level, you're going to want to be able to roll it up. So let me show you how we roll it up. Well, it's really easy. Click a button. Extract RoHS to technical file. Okay, so the RoHS technical file. So what this is doing, the system now is looking at that product and looking at all its components and parts and seeing what declarations do we have on hand, what codes are in there for RoHS, what test reports are on hand. Okay, open this up. Here's the technical file. So again, you have a table of contents, evaluation of the product, testing, all the different sections. What are the appendices? What are the pass codes? What are the fail codes? Here's the drafts. So as we talked about before, here's a picture of the product. Got some different components underneath there. Here's the the official declaration, all the different references that we talked about there. And then you start getting into the product information, right? Remember we talked about that. What are the designs? What are the specifications? All of that's in here. Looking at description of your process. What's the evaluation of the process? Right? What are the types of parts under scope? Custom fab parts, out of scope, pass-fail criteria. I mean, you're getting the idea here. This is a very complex document. Now, this all pulls directly from our system. There are a few sections that need to be written manually because you're basically you're giving a comment on the information in this template. Obviously saves you, hours of time certainly having to put this together manually. And then you're starting to get into the pass codes. So, how many passed? Obviously, you don't want any failed, and how many passed after corrective actions. And then breaking that down at a fabricator level. So here's the fabricator, here's the parts, here's the material. Okay, really going through those. And again, this is a sample technical file, and a real one we have audit of declarations, resolution of failed parts. What was the testing? What is the description of the test one? What is the description of the second test? What were the test results? Pass, fail, inconclusive. And again, this is all pulled directly from the system, and then you have your criteria here. So that's an example of a RoHS technical file. Now, obviously, we're gonna have to augment this slightly. I mean, this is completely in line with 505.8.1 as far as content perspective. The format might have to change. But, the process of extracting that, straight out from our system, I mean, that's not going to change. So now to giving you, we've had a kind of a high-level conversation about this. I've gotten to show you how, how we do technical files. I want to open this up for questions. So there's a question on the toolbar, question kind of panel there on the tool on the right-hand side. If you could go in and submit some questions, I will try to get to as many as I can before my time runs out here in just under 15 minutes or so. Okay, so we have a question about testing and test reports. So there is no mandatory, thou shall, you must test things for, for RoHS compliance. It is a method, however, to, check and monitor and keep, declarations in line and make sure that you're keeping them honest. And it really is a good way to fill the gaps, but it's not like there is something in the regulation that says, you know what, you must test, 5% or something like that. So testing is not mandatory, but it is an excellent way to, prove due diligence, keep your suppliers honest, and a very cost-effective way, in many cases, to fill in gaps. All right. So I have a question about, I've been told that CE mark on outer packaging is our first line of defense. So the CE mark, your CE mark says, this product is compliant with all of the, regulations in scope, that are under the CE marking directive that my product's in scope of, right? So, yeah, EMC, LVD, etc. So to me, that's not a defense, because I thought that's just a mark on the product. For me, when I talk about a first line of defense, I mean, anybody can go put a CE mark on there. I'm thinking your technical file, too. And maybe I'm splitting hairs, but the technical file, which is what backs up the CE mark, that's your first line of defense. And so anything that's in that technical file, that is really what your proof is of the fact that your product meets the requirements of the CE mark. So if someone's saying, hey, the CE mark is the first line of defense, I would agree with them if they meant the technical file, which is the basis by which you apply the CE mark. Yes, and RoHS 2 is now going to be part of the technical file. So that would be my response to that. So I have a question here. What if you have hundreds of models? Does each model have to be tested annually? The answer is no. Again, testing is not mandatory. And when we're thinking of this, and a lot of companies, and I know a lot of you in the same, you might have very similar products. They're just, slightly different colors, different sizes. What you really want to be thinking of here is at the material level, right? I'm using metals, I'm using, printed circuit boards, etc. And so even if you have hundreds of different models, you certainly don't have to test each one, and it would be good to do a, a sample set. For example, let's say I make laptops, and we all know laptops all come in all different shapes and sizes. And you don't have to test each one. You're just you're just doing a spot check, and not even on the whole one. Maybe you're just doing on certain components within them, from certain where the highest risk would be. So people that provide you with printed circuit boards, you're doing a couple of tests on those. So I mean, it's not mandatory to do, and you certainly wouldn't have to test each module. Technical judgment is allowed when you're developing your criteria for what's acceptable and what's a pass-fail, as long as you have a reasonable rationale that can explain as to how you came to these conclusions of being compliant. That's fine, and you don't necessarily have to be testing annually. And I would obviously recommend against doing that. Okay, getting a lot of questions in here. Let me just pick one out. All right, so I have a question here about, and I believe this speaks to the declarations. So with these declarations for EEE, when we're talking about the technical file, does this need to be certified by a third party, such as like Assent Compliance or SGS, or is it a self-certification? So it's a self-certification. So you would be using services like people like us for, maybe software and declarations conformity. Maybe you're using, SGS to do your testing or whatnot. They're providing you that, and they're certifying their portion of it. But as far as the technical file goes, that's a self-certification. Okay, like many of these items in the CE marking directive are. So I mean, it's a self-certification that you're putting on there. So, all right. So, is the technical file required to be submitted to enforcement agencies or customs only as requested, or is it required to be submitted before placing into the market? Is the technical file required for each product or SKU? So, is a technical file required to be provided to enforcement agencies? So, your technical file needs to be provided to your customers. I'm pretty sure as part of any sales contract, they're going to want to have access to that technical file. Because remember that the CE mark now, that technical file, the same thing that you're handing over for EMC, LVD, all of that safety, part of that is now going to include RoHS 2. So you're probably going to be having to hand it over as a matter of sale anyways. It wouldn't have to be submitted proactively to enforcement agencies, but they can request it. So the question is being whether it has to be submitted before it is placed on the market. That depends on what you're looking at. I would imagine that if a customer is going to place a large order with you, they're going to want to see that technical file first. It's probably going to be part of the terms and conditions. So I would say it's not a requirement by law, but I would imagine it's almost definitely a core requirement from a business perspective. When you're looking at, does it have to be submitted to enforcement agents before it's placed on the market? No, absolutely not. So Do you include all test reports, DOC, supplier audit reports in the technical file, or should we just include a summary of the results? So you probably just include a summary of the results, but what you want to do is have a link. You want to have something retrievable. So, obviously you don't want to include 2,000 declarations in a zip file, right, that you're sending over to them. Perhaps a link or something that states, here's a summary, like, for instance, let's show, if you're anything like me, I'm a really visual learner, so let's go over here. Trying to find my pass-fail table. Right, so when you're looking at something like that, this is a summary. We don't want all those declarations, right? So maybe you have a link that says, you can find them here. It depends on your relationship and how you want it set up. Maybe you say, for further information, contact this person, but some way of them at least accessing or requesting all of that backup information. And the same thing goes for test results, etc. Or I have a question about our software. Can our software be integrated with ERPs such as SAP? So yes, our software that you saw there in our database can be fully integrated with SAP, Oracle, Agile, any ERP you can think of. Can be fully integrated to both push and pull information. If you have any questions about costing, I mean, the costing, it varies, right? How big is your company? What kind of customizations? What are your requirements, et cetera? I mean, it can literally run the gamut. Anywhere starting from $10,000, upwards. So, if you want any more information about any of our capabilities, costs, etc., please feel free to contact us, and we would be, happy to provide that information to you. Is testing to EN 62321 definitive in determining compliance, especially with regards to hex chrome coatings? So it's hard to, I wouldn't say it's definitive. I don't think I could really go out on a limb and say something like that. There's always going to be room. There's going to be conclusive results. It really depends on the product, where is it, etc. I can tell you that it is the most effective. So, there's never going to be a perfect test, and things can get expensive. If you have a problem with hex chrome coatings, I mean, I would say 95%, if not higher, of the time that we run into these coatings with our customers, we go back to their suppliers, and boom, it's changed over to trivalent. So, I mean, there's a couple of ways to deal with that. Is it going to be definitive? I don't know if I'd want to go in on a limb and say definitive. I think the folks at SGS would probably be better to answer that than I am. But I can say that it's definitely, I would say, common industry practice. It's the most effective and clearly the most affordable. Will a sample of our technical file be included with the webinar materials? It won't. We'll be clearing that. There's, I mean, we don't, we just won't be including that with that. That's kind of, something that we that was created and something we wouldn't just want out there, so people can copy it from us. But it will not be included through there. If you do want to discuss more about that, though, give us a call and we'd be happy to set something up. All right, so I think I have time for one more question here. So is it possible to issue the declaration for a line or a family of products? Yeah, absolutely, and I think everybody that's been in this situation has dealt with blanket declarations. As long as you have a way of, and think of it this way, what are you currently doing in your technical file for CE marking? Are you issuing it for families of products? Same thing can apply for RoHS then. Just as long as you can explain how you've been able to come to these conclusions for that range of products and why it makes sense, then yeah, you can do that as long as you have some logic in there that's coherent and is going to make sense to the person reading the file. So again, I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions. If you do have any more questions, we are going to get to these and create a Q&A document as we do for all our webinars and put it up on our website. We will be, as soon as all those materials are up, we're going to be sending an email. It's going to have, a link to our site where you can have a look at all those materials. It's also going to have a survey. If you could please fill out the survey, I'd appreciate it. And we also, for those of you that deal in any kind of chemicals or anything, we have a registration webinar coming up next week. And we also have a bunch of webinars coming up over the summer. I'm going to be dealing with a wide range of topics. We have discussion groups coming up. There is, a Q&A specific Q&A webinar where, just going to be this, submitting questions, getting answers. And we're also going to have more of our service-oriented ones where, we're going to have a demonstration webinar. We're going to have an integration webinar where we show how we integrate with different things. So we have a lot of cool webinars coming up. Also keep conflict minerals on your mind. Again, that's still on board, looking like June, but how many times have we heard that conflict minerals is going to be promulgated soon, right? So, but again, as soon as that comes out, we're all over that. I've actually spoken to commissioners at the SEC, so I've got some interesting insights that I can give for that. We're also looking at new REACH SBHCs being released, right? So there's a lot of interesting webinars coming up over the next few months. Sign up to our blog, get on the RSS feed, because that way, you're just going to get a little message anytime we have any of these new webinars. And thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate all of your time, and I hope to speak to some of you soon. Take care.